This morning, our message is going to come from the book of Habakkuk, and I'm going to start a 4-week series today on the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk chapter 1 is the text we'll be reading. I will share it on my screen in just a moment. There it is. Habakkuk 1, verse 1. Now, I do have to give credit where credit is due. A while ago, I read a series of sermons by a pastor in Lake Forest, Illinois. His name is Lee Eckloff. Lee presented a series of sermons to his congregation on the book of Habakkuk, and if I want you to know that if you go online, if you read Lee Eckloff's sermons and you think they sound like mine, it's not because Lee Eckloff borrowed from me, it's because I'm borrowing from Lee Eckloff in this series of sermons. I found a number of insights in his sermons that I thought would be helpful, especially given this time and the circumstances that we are facing. And in Habakkuk 1 is where we turn to today, and this is what we read in Habakkuk 1. Habakkuk 1, beginning with verse 1, says this: "The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like a vulture swooping to devour. They all come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They deride kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. They build earthen ramps and capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own strength is their God. O Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, we will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute judgment. O Rock, you have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrong. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made men like fish in the sea, like sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest foods. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint." That's as far as we read God's word. This is the word of the Lord today. I believe most of us understand that life does not always go smoothly. We have a certain level of tolerance for interruptions and frustrations, and we adjust. When our alarm doesn't go off in time in the morning, we adjust and we hurry up our pace of getting ready. When our hours are cut at work, we compensate and we make adjustments. We understand when someone cancels weekend plans due to an illness. I'm not saying we like it. I'm saying in our lifetime, at least in a world stained by sin, we have to be ready to adjust to plans falling short, to frustrations and interruptions. In fact, if we can't adapt to interruptions and frustrations, we will find that we live with a high level of disappointment that isn't just occasional, but that kind of shapes our days and our lives and our outlook. However, if we become too accustomed to graciously accepting interruptions, we can quickly reach a level where we've gone beyond what we think is reasonable. There are times when the frustrations seem to be too much. When it seems like I've tolerated enough, this gets to be too much. There's a pastor in Chicago. His name is Pastor Corey Brooks. He's in the Inglewood area. And in 2013, Pastor Brooks reached a point where he became so frustrated with gang violence that he wanted to do something about it. He understood there would be a certain level of violence in all communities, but it got to be too much when he had to perform the funeral of a teenage boy. And as a result of that funeral, Pastor Brooks decided to host a fundraiser to help build a community center. And he stayed on top of a hotel building, and he was going to live there until he raised enough money to begin the project of a new community center in his community. The problem was, while he was up there, there was not one, but there were two more incidents where teenage boys lost their lives due to gang violence in their community. You can imagine in a situation like that, Pastor Brooks or people of that community saying, we understand that there are going to be times when we are frustrated, when we tolerate evil, but this is too much. And we can understand why someone who trusts in God may turn to God and say, Lord, can't you do something? There are so many times when there are tragedies, and these tragic situations seem to have little hope of improvement in the near future. And we wonder, God, isn't it about time you break in? Have you ever had a moment like that where you've wondered, Lord, why haven't you done something already? And when can I expect you to break in? If we get sick, we expect to be better. If we have a loss of an ability, we write it off to growing older, and that's what happens in life. But when the situation seems to get worse and continues to get worse, and we don't even see a change of directions, we may turn to God and say, Lord, when's it going to be time for you to step in? This is the kind of situation that Habakkuk was in when he wrote his prophetic book that we're going to look at for the next few weeks. In most prophetic books of the Bible, there's this discussion, this presentation of words that God has spoken. Most prophetic books of the Bible begin with God speaking to the prophet, and then the prophet turning to the people and bringing God's message to the people. The book of Habakkuk is different. In this book of Habakkuk, instead of the prophet bringing God's message to the people, we have a glimpse of God and Habakkuk moving back and forth in a conversation. And in this prayer time that Habakkuk comes to the Lord, he's very bold in expressing his frustration in the situation that he is facing. Habakkuk lived about 600 years, about 6 centuries before Jesus Christ was born. And he lived in a time of chaos. God's people were hurting. And the struggle was, it was God's people who were hurting each other. It was a community that was in chaos. And Habakkuk was crying out to God, God, you've been our covenant God. You set us free from Egypt. Why aren't you stepping in and doing something? Habakkuk's frustration was not just that there was violence, not just that there was communities in chaos, but his frustration was God said he was going to step in. God promised that he would uphold justice. God promised he would bring punishment. And why isn't he doing it? You see, when injustice reigns, the innocent cry for relief. I don't know about you, but most of my lifetime, when I thought of a God as a God of judgment, that scared me. I didn't like thinking of God as a God of judgment, because I knew that meant God was going to judge me. And my biggest fears in life, because I've been blessed and I've lived in a land where there is a relative sense of justice that prevails, my biggest fears have been when God judges, that he's going to look at me and my sins are going to be judged. And so to think of God as a God of judgment is something that causes me to say, I'm not so sure I like that idea. I don't want God judging. But when you are someone who is innocent, when you are a victim of heartless violence, when you are living in a land where gang violence takes the life of teenage boys, you want some kind of justice. You want some kind of mercy to be instilled. You want people to get what they deserve. Historically, think of what happened during the Holocaust, when Nazi Germany's were ruthlessly taking the lives and persecuting Jewish people just based on their ethnic identity. There were many who were crying out, Lord, when will you bring an end to this? They wanted God's judgment. Think of in our own nation's history, in the time of slavery, when people based on the color of their skin were treated with a reckless kind of dehumanizing abandonment. They cried out, Lord, when will you step in? They wanted judgment. They wanted God to step in. Have you ever had a moment like that? Have you ever had a moment that you weren't thinking about God looking at your own sin and corruption, but you wanted God to set things right in the world around you? And you had that moment of, in your time of prayer, saying, Lord, it's time for you to step in. And when Habakkuk does this, he's at that point. He's saying, Lord, we want you to step in. Lord, why haven't you stopped this? Look at those verses. It says in verse 3, why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. And then in verse 4, he says, therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. What he's saying there is, what good are laws? What good are empty threats, Lord? Back in the book of Deuteronomy, God had said if his people were faithful to him and obeyed his commands, they would prosper. And if people were unrighteous, they disobeyed him, they would suffer punishment. Habakkuk looked at his land and said, Lord, there are some of your covenant people who are persecuting and hurting other of your covenant people. Why aren't you making those promises? And why aren't you keeping your word? Why aren't you stepping in? Because it seems like the wicked are prospering. This kind of prayer makes me uneasy. It makes me uneasy the way that Habakkuk becomes so bold in God's presence, the way he voices his complaint so easily. But before we move into that complaint, I want us to recognize what has really happened here. And Habakkuk is very good about this. Habakkuk does not blame God for what has happened. I think that's what often happens in our world today. That we see the evil, we see the havoc in the world around us, and we say, Lord, why did you do this? Habakkuk is not blaming God. He's saying, Lord, why haven't you stepped in? If I could speak in God's defense, God doesn't create the evil and the chaos and the havoc in our world. God had a plan in place in creation where everything would work well, where there would be no death, no illness, no natural disasters. The problem always happens when humans take things into their own hands. Have you ever had someone come to you for help when it's almost too late? They come to you and say, I would like you to give me some financial advice because I'm in a little bit of a pinch here. I went to school and I got a degree, but I can't find a job in that degree. And I have $200,000 of debt for school. And by the way, my education debt is on a government loan that even if I declare bankruptcy, I still owe that money. And then after I graduated, because I thought I would get a job, I bought a house and I bought a nice car, and I've been living on credit cards for 2 years now, and my debt is just skyrocketed and it's enormous. Do you have any good ideas for how I can get out of this problem? When someone comes to you with a problem like that, what you want to fix it is a time machine. You want to go back and say, I wish I could help you not make those decisions because right now it's a mess and I don't know how to fix this. Habakkuk recognizes that. Habakkuk recognizes that the situation is a mess and the innocent are hurting, but it's not because of God. It's because human sin and evil has wreaked havoc. I think that's one of the things we have to realize too. When we are guilty of sin, it wreaks havoc. It may not come back on us immediately, but it wreaks havoc in the lives of others. When we tell lies, we have hurt ourselves because we are known now not to be trustworthy. But we've also hurt others because we've made them believe certain things that aren't true. And how those lies move forward and cause people to have a warped view of creation and the world around them, we don't know how that's going to work out. We don't know what damage that's going to do. Oftentimes we come to this place of Habakkuk's prayer because of sin in our own lives. We come to this place in Habakkuk's prayer because of sin in the world around us. But there's nothing we can do. And so we turn to God. The sad reality is that sin in our world causes some situations that really are this bad. Where gang violence takes the lives of teenagers, where the violence and the corruption in the book of Habakkuk causes people to turn away from each other and treat each other carelessly. And that's why Habakkuk says the law is paralyzed. When God answers, that answer isn't very comforting. In verses 5 through 11, God seems to say, look, here's what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is you watch the nations, for I'm going to do something that you won't believe. He was going to raise up the Babylonians, and the Babylonians were going to come in. Now, when God says that, Habakkuk had to hear that and think, this is not at all what I had in mind, God. To put it in today's terms, if we were to pray, Lord, please stop the gang violence that happens in so many urban areas, it would be like God saying, I have an idea. I'm going to bring in terrorists from the Middle East to take over the inner cities. We would think that's ridiculous. That's not an answer to prayer. But that's what Habakkuk hears God saying. God says, I know that my people are hurting one another, and so here's what I'm going to do. The Babylonians are going to be raised up. They're going to have power, and they are going to come in, and they are going to start this process of what I am doing. God's presence is surprising in this text because God is saying it's going to get worse before it gets better. And Habakkuk complains about that. Habakkuk isn't pacified just because God answered. In Habakkuk's second response, in verses 12 and following, we see Habakkuk turning to God. And I want you to notice how he turns. He says, "O Lord." And when you see the word Lord, if it's still on your screen, "O Lord," that's all capital letters. That's the name of God. In the King James Version, that would be, "O Jehovah." You're calling him by name. In the Hebrew, the word was Yahweh. He says, "Oh God, why are you are from everlasting." He says, "O Lord," and he calls the Lord my God, my Holy One, my rock. He's crying out to God using his name. And if you ever notice, when you use people's names, it's often because you're making this special kind of plea to get their attention. You're reminding them of who they are in relationship to you. And what Habakkuk seems to be saying here is, Lord, I just want you to live up to your name. I just want you to do what you promised you would do. You promised you would step in and set things right. You promised the wicked would be punished. And this doesn't make sense because the Babylonians were known to be wicked. And he goes on to say, notice all this talk in verses 14 and following about the nets and how they would sacrifice to their nets. What he is saying is, Lord, you're treating the people of Israel like seafood. We're going to get caught up in the nets of the Babylonians, and you're not going to be praised for that. The Babylonians are going to praise their nets. They're not going to praise you. He makes this bold complaint, and he continues to argue with God. And as I said before, this prayer makes me uneasy. Years ago, I had a friend in ministry, a pastor, and he was going through a personally difficult time. And he presented some sermons to our group, and it was sermons on Habakkuk, and he was bringing this. And I remember talking to him saying, you have to be careful because your own personal crises, when you bring them into preaching, I'm afraid you're going to cause more concern than comfort. I still struggle with whether or not he should have preached those sermons the way he presented them to us. But I'm uneasy with this for more reason because there's such a boldness in approaching God. There's this naming of concerns. And I think when I first heard this or read this text, my uneasiness was towards Habakkuk. My thought was, Habakkuk, you really shouldn't pray like that. You really shouldn't speak to God in that manner. But the more I read this text, the more I become uneasy, not because of Habakkuk, but because of me. I become uneasy not because Habakkuk prays like this, but because I don't. You see, in a world where sin does prevail, we can become so complacent and so accustomed to the sin and evil in our world that we just overlook it. And we don't look for God to intervene. Or we think that we have the answers. We think that it's just going to be a matter of us changing a few little things and then everything will be better. And that's just not the case. We need God to step in. And sometimes we are not as passionate and we are not as committed to God stepping in as Habakkuk is. Granted, what God said to Habakkuk, that with the Babylonians coming in, that would have seemed shocking to Habakkuk. That would not have seemed like an answer to prayer. But I love the faith that Habakkuk demonstrates. The faith he demonstrates is seen in the last little verse here. The last verse at the bottom of the right corner of that page. There, Habakkuk says in verse 1 of chapter 2, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. Now, The story's not done with Habakkuk 2. We'll go through more of the book later on, but just in this initial prayer, in the response and in the answer, we see Habakkuk complaining with a justifiable complaint. There's wickedness, and we don't see it going the way God promised. God letting Habakkuk know, soon in your lifetime, I'm going to make matters even worse to set things right. Habakkuk complaining and saying, honestly, Lord, that doesn't make sense to me, but he says it in faith. And when we pray these kinds of prayers, that's the balance. God allows us, in fact, you look at Psalms, God encourages us. He teaches us and demonstrates how to pray like this when we have complaints. But Habakkuk says, but I'm going to keep waiting. I'm going to wait for you. You see, God's answers will not always make our frustrations go away instantaneously. But God does reassure that he hasn't left us alone. And God does promise he is still going to be faithful to his plans. Our hope in prayer is not that when we complain, God will react right away and make things better. Our hope in prayer is that God has not given up. Sometimes, even when we're at our wits' end and circumstances seem to be getting worse, things will get worse before they get better. We know that. Think of having a surgery. If you have pain in your back to the point that you need back surgery, you know that the surgery is going to start off making things worse before it gets better. And what God is saying here to Habakkuk is, I'm stepping in and it's going to get worse before it gets better. But because God hasn't given up, and because he will never give up, even in our frustrations, we can have hope. We can cry out to God with our complaints. We can be very clear in the concerns that we have, and we can express with trust that we will wait for him, because we have confidence that God always has, and he always will live up to his name.